Next, we move to Tumisang. Tumisang on the macroeconomic effect of fiscal policy in South Africa. The floor is yours, Tumisang.
Thank you. Okay, so today I'll be presenting the work that I've been doing with the co-authors, who are also the organizers of this workshop. And it's work that started a while back, but we've kind of completed the sort of a first draft in the past 5 months or so, and we'll be sharing the results. And what we're looking at is basically what are the macro effects of legislated tax changes in South Africa using the narrative approach that is mainly by Roma and Roma. And in doing that, we basically seek to make 3 contributions. The first contribution is basically constructing a new narrative measure for changes in personal income taxes. And then the second and third contribution is more empirical. And in this regard, we then use this new measure in a new methodology that hasn't really been explored in South Africa, which is the proxy SVAR, and then look at the dynamic effects of this shock. As I've indicated, we'll be looking at personal income taxes, which constitute quite a very significant share of the total revenue in South Africa. And during the period that we're looking at, which is the post-apartheid era, this tax revenue contributed between around 30% and 40% of the total revenue, which is quite a very significant portion. And not only that, but when you also look, you compare it to other countries, where you compare South Africa to other countries, you can see that there's this high reliance in South Africa on personal income taxes, where, for example, according to this OECD study in 2018, personal income taxes contribute about 35% of the total share, whereas, for example, in OECD countries, you have the average of about 24%, in African countries, we have about 17%, and in Latin American countries, we have about 10%. So this is quite a very significant portion of total taxes, and considering that this is one tax where you have quite a very few taxpayers. This picture basically shows what Serena has also touched on, which is basically just the evolution of some of the fiscal variables over the post-apartheid period. So you have government spending, tax revenue, and government debt, all as a percentage of your GDP. And what, I mean, we know that we can kind of divide this into 2 periods, where you have, one period of decline in government spending during the fiscal consolidation that followed after the installation of the new government in 1994, which led to this reduction in spending and therefore the reduction in your government debt. And then you then start having this period of rapid increase in government spending and therefore your government debt. And in terms of your tax revenue, I think the interesting period is this one here during the early 2000s, leading up to the global financial crisis, where you had this increase in tax revenue as a percentage of GDP due to the economy doing well and also the commodity cycle, which then decreased during the global financial crisis and somewhat recovered, mainly due to increase in taxes. Now, pretty much over the past 10 years, and I think this Serena has also touched on, is the fact that government spending, the increase in government spending over the past 10 years hasn't really resulted in the increase in output. And in addition to that, the tax increases that followed during that period to reduce your government debt has actually stifled households' income and therefore aggregate demand. And this, according to Fundraise is why fiscal multipliers have been low. And it is in this literature, or in this view, that we're also trying to add to understand what has been the effect of personal income taxes on some of these macroeconomic variables. Just a brief summary of our findings. So we look at the sample period between 1996 and 2019, which is just focusing on the current political regime. And our first contribution is this proxy measure of tax shocks. And what we find with it, and what one would want to find with the proxy, is that the measure that you're using as a proxy should have some positive relationship with the shock that you're trying to measure, the unobservable shock. And we do find this positive relationship between the two. And what's interesting is when you look at, or when you exclude the last 10 years where government debt was increasing, you actually find a much higher positive relationship. The second contribution, more on the empirical side, is that you do find that tax cuts were expansionary, leading to increase in consumption and its subcomponents, which are investment and, was expansionary, leading to increase in output, and also its subcomponents, consumption and investment. You do find bigger effects when you only look at tax changes that only focus on changes in your marginal tax rates. And then lastly, we also find implied tax multipliers greater than 1 for the impact, the peak. Now, in terms of the literature, so in South Africa, the focus has mainly been on exploring different methodologies in the fiscal multiplier literature, that is, looking at these different methodologies to estimate your fiscal multipliers. And what you find at the moment is that while we've explored these different methodologies, and we do find different estimates for your fiscal multipliers, we haven't yet explored, to the best of my knowledge, the other approaches which seek to identify tax shocks outside of the time series. And the one approach that's more specific to this research is the narrative approach of identifying fiscal shocks. And this, as we know, is mainly led by the Roma and Roma in the two famous papers, but it has also been looked at by Remy and the two IMF papers, on the first one being on the OECD and the second one on Latin American countries, where they document fiscal consolidation episodes, also using historical records. And of course, these then have been applied in the literature using different methodologies. Now, the basis of the narrative analysis, or the narrative approach, is basically to look at historical records and identify the motivations for these tax changes or legislated tax changes. Now, borrowing from Roma and Roma, what they argue is that changes in your tax changes are basically determined by two shocks. The first one being the VAR-epsilon shocks. The authors indicate that these shocks are what they call the endogenous tax shocks, and the main motivation for the change in taxes basically is that when you have a direct or an indirect shock that could affect your output, and therefore the output gap, then the policymaker would then respond to that shock, so that output then returns to normal, or we want to close that output gap. And the two subcategories under this category of endogenous tax changes, which is your under this bar epsilon. You have your countercyclical measures. So during a recession, you might cut taxes so that you can stimulate demand and return output to its normal. And then the other category is these, what they call the government spending driven tax changes. And the example that they give in this category is where you have, government would run an expansionary government spending program, but because they expect that to be somewhat inflationary, then they would then counter that expected inflationary effect with an increase in your taxes. And then the second types of changes that determine that the tax changes are, what they would then group under the exogenous tax changes. And these changes are not really driven by current economic conditions. And under these, they do have, again, two subcategories. The first one being the deficit-driven tax changes. And here they argue that, when the policy maker respond to an increase in deficit, they're not necessarily responding to the current conditions or the future economic conditions, but more of past decisions or past economic conditions. And then you then have this other subcategory of long-run tax changes, which basically just lump all other exogenous tax changes that could not be classified under the deficit-driven tax changes. Okay, as indicated, we are looking at all the legislated tax changes during the period 1996 until 2019, and to do that, we obviously have to use historical records, and these include the budget speeches and reviews, the medium-term budget policy statements, the taxation laws, bills or act, or the revenues laws, bills or acts. And then you also have the explanatory memorandums, and these were very important because these are the documents that would go through each tax change and basically explain what's the motivation behind the change. And that's where we basically get the motivations for the tax changes from these explanatory memorandums, because they tend to be more detailed. Now, some of the characteristics of the shocks includes the timing of the shock, and that is when the tax change become effective. So, for example, you have the finance minister announcing that the tax rate would, for example, the tax rate would, let's say, you're introducing a new top tax bracket effective the 1st of March, and that then becomes the timing of the shock. And then in terms of this...
Hilton with a question. Hilton, okay. Go ahead.
Tumisang, yes, so just quickly, did you consider, so I think there's two ways to approach this. One is you pick the announcement that you want to assess. So the paper I shared in the chat here, looks specifically at consolidation announcements, and then how the follow-up of a tax increase or a spending cut took place. Where here, if I'm getting this right, is that you're looking at all sorts of changes. Is this a continuous series over the sample from 96 to 2019? Are you picking specific things, or are you just going ex post trying to explain what you're observing? It's not clear, the distinction for me, if they follow that. So are you picking specific decisions by the fiscal authority and then evaluating, that anticipation or announcement effect, or to identify the shock or whatever? Or are you looking at a bunch of decisions that were made, distinguishing them between tax and spending, and then ex post trying to infer something from that?
Okay, so it's more of the first one. So you picking the tax well, change, yeah, so you pick in the announced change in the text. So that would be, the first point would obviously be from, the budget speech. And then what is the anticipated effect, the anticipated revenue effect of that change for each year?
Yeah, so it's not one direction, you're still considering both directions.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, and then as I've indicated, then the size of the shock would then be what's the expected revenue effect of that change. So for example, the finance minister will announce that we are choosing to cut taxes and this will cost us, let's say, 15 billion in revenue. So that's a revenue loss, the expected revenue loss for them. And then another important issue is then normalizing the shocks. And in this regard, we pretty much follow what Mertens and Ravn did. They normalize the shocks by the tax base. And in this case, we use wages. So then the shock would then be, let's say, the 15 billion as a percentage of the taxable income, which is your wages in this regard. And then in terms of the personal income taxes, in this case would include the normal pay as you earn or the employee tax, and then the employment tax incentive that was introduced, which started from the 1st of Jan 2014. Okay, now the fiscal policy instrument that we're interested in is the average personal income tax rate, which is the change in your personal tax revenue. So this is the realized personal income tax revenue, the change in that, and normalized by your personal taxable income. And we obviously this measure, changes in personal income taxes can be influenced by quite a various factors, policy and non-policy factors. So then the whole point of us then creating this narrative is that we then want to create the proxy for this average personal income tax rate. But then this proxy is only captures these, what we identify as exogenous tax changes. And then the narrative is, as I've indicated, would then be, again, the expected changes in your revenue or personal income taxes, and then again also normalized by the tax base, which is the personal taxable income. So all in all, we end up with about 45 personal income tax shocks, and of those 25, we then classify them as exogenous and use it for this analysis. Another important characteristic is, whether a shock was anticipated or unanticipated. In Mertens and Ravn paper, they classify unanticipated shocks as shocks or tax changes that were implemented in less than a quarter after they were legislated. Now, the thing in South Africa is that tax changes are normally legislated retroactive. So in this case, then this kind of no longer applies, because then most of these tax changes become or fall under unanticipated tax changes. And then the other characteristic is whether the change is transitory or permanent. So in terms of transitory changes, these are changes that are effective for a certain period, whereas your permanent changes are one where there is no, like a sunset clause on that change. And in this case, most of the tax changes in South Africa are then classified as more transitory tax changes. Okay, I'm not sure if there's a question.
How long is the time period? Are the results sensitive to the timing of the denominator in the APITR?
Okay, so the time, so this, I mean, it's quarterly data over 24 years, so as I've indicated, from 96 until 2019. And then in terms of the sensitivity to the denominator, that's something that still needs to be checked, because at the moment, only looking at where the, the tax rate is only normalized by wages.
So, sorry to kind of hog this now, but it's interesting. Because if it's personal income tax, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, this should be then at least a year delay. So if you're trying to get to the average rate of the revenue collected, it will be based on the previous year's income earned, correct?
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering why the choice of lagging by one period. It just seemed rather in between, going contemporaneous versus the like you just moving from one quarter, not one quarter. Perhaps it should be like a moving average of the previous year, or at least a full quarter or something. I don't know, but have you thought about that a little bit more?
Okay, so the reason for using the lag, normalizing by the lagged taxable income is, and I think this has also been cited in or mentioned in Barrow and Reddick. So what you want to avoid is, if you do it contemporaneously, then you might have these kind of endogeneity problem, because the changes in your average, changes in your revenue also depends on the tax base, which is included in the calculation of your tax revenue. So you kind of want to avoid that.
Yeah, and this is also correlated with GDP, this tax base, and you really want to avoid, this link.
Okay. Now this table summarizes pretty much the main tax changes, personal income tax changes, and one can actually summarize the tax changes into like 3 periods. Now you have, starting with the installation of the new government, you had a new government coming in, and then they then restructured or reformed rather the personal income taxes, and they did this by reducing the tax brackets, and some of this reduction in the tax brackets came with some changes in your marginal tax rates, right? So this is the first period of this huge tax reforms in South Africa in the 1990s. Then you move on to the second period where government goes from, okay, fine, we've done these tax reforms which we are happy with, and we've also broadened the tax base by introducing other taxes, and from there then they started running this expansionary tax policy where they just gave this massive tax reliefs, and this is the second period. And the reason for that was that the revenue was starting to increase, and again this is a period when the economy was also starting to do well. There was this optimism, and also with increased corporate tax revenue, corporate revenue due to increase in commodity prices. So you had this wonderful period where government could just give these massive tax cuts, and this period also included the period where your marginal tax rates were reduced from 45% to, I mean, the top rate from 45% to 42% and eventually to then 40%. So the first two periods, we can, see them as, a period where we classify them as these exogenous changes because, for example, the first period, the motivation there was making the tax system fair and progressive. And then the second motivation was more of, okay, let's give these tax reduction, but in the hope of, more of with a long-term view of we want the economy to grow at a much higher rate. So that's why these tax changes in the case of Roma and Roma are classified more as, these long-run tax changes. Then you have in between this countercyclical tax policy, and then you move on to the past, I would say 6 or 7 years, where government then started increasing taxes through giving lower than inflation, adjustments, or in some other cases also increasing the marginal tax rate. So maybe let me also just explain here in terms of classifying. So you look at, yes, you have the budget statement, so you do look at the narrative record, but another way of trying to get a feel of whether fiscal tax changes were expansionary or contractionary was to look at the changes in the tax brackets and see if the tax brackets were adjusted for just inflation, or you had tax brackets being adjusted for inflation and above. So where you see this expansionary is when there were these massive or above inflation adjustments in the tax brackets, whereas in contractionary, this is the period when government gave less than inflation adjustments to the tax brackets. And then the other classification or characteristics that I've mentioned is, whether the tax change is seen as permanent or transitory. And here is just basically capturing where, changes in marginal tax rates tend to be more permanent because we increase or we reduce the, let's say the top marginal tax rate from 45% to 42 until whenever time we decide to either increase or decrease it. So these, where you see the yeses under the permanent tax changes, it's mainly focused more on these tax changes that were that included changes in your marginal tax rates. Now, the next part is the basically just the graphical representation of the table. So the red is all the tax changes. Then the blue, you then have the average personal income tax rates, and then these are then plotted against the recession dates, the South African recession dates from the St. Louis Fed. And what you see is, some of the tax cuts. So the negative indicates a tax cut, whereas a positive indicates a tax increase. So a contractionary tax policy, whereas here it's more of an expansionary tax policy. And you do see that some of the tax cuts do coincide with the recession dates, but again, as indicated, this were during your tax reforms, and here you had these massive tax reliefs. And then lastly, you have this contractionary tax policy where government was more concerned about the budget, the widening budget deficit, and therefore started increasing the taxes through both below inflation tax reliefs and also increase in the marginal tax rates. This, again, it's a same representation, but now looking at the sub expansion periods, comparing it with the sub expansion periods. And I think pretty much the main point here is that during the early 2000s, leading up to the global financial crisis, tax policy was more pro-cyclical, And then now you have, again, a pro-cyclical tax policy because, we are now in this downturn, but yet, government had to increase taxes because of the fiscal position that it finds itself in. The methodology that we use is the structural VAR instrumental variable model by Mertens and Ravn. And this methodology basically just links the normal SVAR model with your IV regression. And what it does is it allows you to use external information for identification in an SVAR model. And as in the IV literature, your instrumental variable needs to be positively correlated with your shock of interest, which is the VAR epsilon 1. And in this case, this would then be our average personal income tax rate shock. So there's some positive correlation, but it should not be correlated with the other shocks in the equation. And then this is the relationship between your reduced form residuals and your structural shocks, with the B matrix being your impulse matrix. And then equation 5 establishes is used to estimate the covariance matrix between your instrumental variable and your residuals. Okay, and then lastly, this is the most important equation is the basically it's similar to your IV regression, where what you are doing is you want to estimate the effects of B1 of your tax of your shock of interest, which is your average personal income tax rate, on your other variables using your IV as an instrument, right? So Mertens and Ravn, using these equations, then develop this, it's a 3-step process to then estimate the effects of your shock of interest on the other macroeconomic variables using this instrument, similar in an IV setup. And the first step is you would estimate your reduced form VAR to get your residuals, and then you would then regress those residuals on the narrative to then get these the covariance metrics between the narrative and the reduced form VAR, and then impose this restriction in equation 6 to then calculate the B1 matrix. So what I forgot to say is that so you have your impulse matrix, which is the B matrix, and what they do is they partition this matrix into 2. So you have your B1 matrix, which is basically if you have your average personal income tax rate ordered first, then it will be the first row of the B matrix, so your impulse matrix. And then you then have a B2, which would then be the other coefficients in the B matrix. And then they then further partition this B1 matrix into the B11, which is the shock that you're trying to identify. So this is the personal income tax rate shock. And then the B21 are then the other coefficients in that first row, which are the response of the other variables to your shock of interest.
Perfect. Tumisang, can you maybe move to the results so that we leave a bit of time for question if there is any.
Okay, yeah. So we run 3 specifications at the moment. So there's the benchmark specification is the full sample with all the shocks. Then we only look at the permanent tax shocks. And then lastly, we look at the much shorter sample, and it's a 5 VAR model. So in each VAR, you replace the last 2 variables with any of the combination of these ones. Okay, so For the full sample and all shocks, here you're looking at a tax cut, and the results then indicate that we have a reduction in taxes, which then lead to an increase in both government spending, but also your GDP and private investment, and government debt also increased, though not that significant. And then when you then look at include the other variables, so now it's the same model, but just replacing the last two variables then with your personal income tax revenue and durable consumption, you find that the tax cut reduces your tax revenue in the first year, and then also increases your durable household consumption. And then lastly, with the full sample, you do find that an expansionary tax policy does have some effect on unemployment. So the unemployment rate does go down, and similar to durable household consumption, you do have this positive effect on non-durable household consumption. Then the second part is again looking at the full sample, but only looking at tax changes that focus on changes in marginal tax rates. And qualitatively, the results are similar. You do have this positive effect on your GDP and investment, and then also government spending, government debt increase. The results though indicate that the effect is a bit on real GDP is higher than in the benchmark specification. The effect on tax revenue in the first year, the decline is not that significant, but you still find significant effects on both types of household consumption and a reduction in your unemployment rate. And then lastly, looking at the shorter sample period, similar to Serena, looking at the period when debt was not that high, you find that the effect on GDP again is higher compared to your benchmark specification and also more persistent, and also on your private investment, whereas the effect on government debt is not that significant. And then lastly, there isn't any reduction in your personal income taxes that you observe with the other specifications. And again, unemployment goes down, and the two types of household consumption also increase. Now, in terms of the implied tax multipliers, so these are the impact and peak tax multipliers with the associated coefficients or elasticities. So what we find is that at the peak, you do find multipliers higher than 1. And also what's interesting is when you only look at the permanent tax shocks, so these are the shocks that only focus on where the changes in the marginal tax rates, you do find a much higher tax multiplier. Similar, when you look at the shorter sample period, you do also find a higher multiplier relative to when you look at the full sample with all the shocks. And then another important thing is also you want to then know how good is this proxy as a measure of your unobservable structural shock. And they in the Mertens and Ravn, they report 2 tests. This one test is done in the model. They estimate this reliability measure, which is basically they regress the narrative measure on your structural shock of interest, and then you want to then estimate the coefficients to see how big or how strong is that relationship. And this reliability measure takes a value between 0 and 1, with values close to 1 indicate that the narrative is a good measure of the structural shock that you are trying to measure. And these are the results. And what you see here is that when you look at the permanent shocks and the shorter sample period, you do find that the proxy becomes a good measure, or the quality of identification improves, and more specifically with the shorter sample. And then lastly, another simple way is to then run an OLS regression between the narrative and the shock of interests. And what we again find is that there is a positive relationship between the two, and this relationship is much stronger when you look at the shorter time period. And basically, this is the result in the study.
Thank you. Few questions. Michael, you go first.
Yeah. I'm just interested because I think, as the presenter points out, you have this very pro-cyclical structure of policy over the period, where during the commodity boom, extensive tax cuts and extensive relief for fiscal drag, really large numbers, and the opposite during the deceleration of growth over the last 10 years. But the thing that I'm trying to understand is that the kind of use of fiscal drag and bracket adjustments is not really, I mean, how often was that a kind of explicitly announced policy target? Because usually that's the reason fiscal drag is used. Certainly when I was in Treasury, the reason we resorted to fiscal drag quite strongly was that nobody would notice. That if you raise a tax rate, people notice and it becomes a big deal. But if you use the brackets and I mean, I remember being shocked at several budgets where we gained significant revenue by manipulating the brackets, and it's like nobody noticed. Everybody was happy, even the tax advisors were happy. People prefer it. So I'm trying to understand this kind of explicit policy announcements as a strategy in relation to the use of brackets, which are used deliberately to kind of keep things under the radar and not make announcements.
Okay, so in terms of, yes, I do agree with the use of fiscal drag in the earlier fiscal years was not explicit, right? So then the recommendation was then you need to then separate the inflation adjustment from the real tax cuts, and that's where the part where you look at the whether the tax brackets were adjusted just for inflation or they were adjusted for inflation and above. So meaning that they were actually resulted in real tax cuts. So the exercise they involved, trying to then reduce the size of the announcement to say, this was what was announced, but this part should be allocated for inflation adjustment. So it would then be considered more of an endogenous tax change. But anything above that, where you would then consider it as a real tax cut, would then fall under the exogenous tax cut. So we did make an attempt to reduce the announced changes. So in a similar way where there was a fiscal drag, and or they were below inflation adjustments. So then, but that wouldn't be, some would miss it. But if there was a below inflation adjustment, we wouldn't treat it as an exogenous tax shock, or even in some way one can actually, you have to treat it as a tax increase, and then look at, then whether you classify that tax increase from fiscal drag as exogenous or endogenous. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Yes, so maybe if he can, if Michael can help us to have to identify more those periods, we could further, I think, pin down the analysis by refining the anticipated versus the unanticipated. Because if I understand well, some of the policy changes were hidden to the public, if I understand well. The first question is how we can systematically identify those. I don't know. And in that sense, I think we could indeed doing some more heterogeneous analysis by distinguishing those periods. That will be, I think, helpful. And maybe also he made a point about commodity price at the boom. I think this is also a fair thing to think about. We were planning also to control systematically for that, and this is something we will, I think, do. I don't know whether Nicola want to add something.
No, that's perfect.
Yeah,
it's great. All right, that's great. Thank you.